everybody. Thank you for coming to Tweens, Teens, and Tech Youth Integrating Conversations about Digital Media Consumption through the Library. I just wanted to start briefly by introducing myself. My name is Manuela Aronofsky, and I have been the middle school technology integrator at Berkeley Carroll School in Brooklyn since the 2019-2020 school year. My first year was a wild ride working in a tech position because, as I'm sure everyone in this audience knows, we went remote that year. So my job took kind of a crazy left turn in March. But I graduated from Pratt's Information School in 2019. My concentration was in youth literacy and outreach. I'm currently working towards my school library and media specialist certification at Queens College, which will work towards my public school library certification. And other library-related things, I'm also currently serving as the Ask Children and Technology co-chair, and I'm an organizer with the Prison Library Support Network. At Berkeley Carroll, I teach a 5th and 8th grade class called Digital Essentials, and I'll explain more about my school and this class in just a moment. Throughout the day, I support all middle school students with their school-issued devices. We are a one-to-one school with 5th and 6th graders having an iPad and 7th and 8th graders having their own Chromebook. I also collaborate with teachers to integrate technology successfully, responsibly, and efficiently into their classrooms. As I know all educators in the audience know, I do a whole hodgepodge of other things every day, including equity and inclusion coordination and leading various electives from pickling to podcasting. So my aim today is really to mirror a conversation I would have with 8th graders, meaning I hope to make it engaging and conversational. I've also tried to make it aesthetically pleasing, which is one tip I've learned can really go a long way with older middle grades in particular. You can see the flow of my session here. I'm going to start with an icebreaker in the chat, which mirrors a digital wellness circle question that I would start with in one of my classes. Then I'll explain a bit about Digital Essentials class in general. Then I'll share a few of the takeaways I've learned this year talking about conversations specifically with 8th graders relating to digital wellness. After that, I'll touch briefly on some of the transitions that I've observed between 5th grade technology use and 8th grade. And before concluding, I will suggest some collaborative opportunities for integrating conversations about digital wellness into the classroom, as well as tips I've gathered for what has worked in facilitating successful conversations and what hasn't. I do really want to make an important disclaimer before I start. This presentation is my personal experience as an educator who is currently bridging the gap between youth libraries and a tech role. Sometimes it feels like I'm inventing my job as I go, which is to say my position is unique, as is everybody else's who works in the capacity of an information professional in schools. But I know I am very fortunate to have a regular classroom platform to have these discussions. Also, every classroom and every school looks different. Today, I'm only able to share personal takeaways from my own classrooms. Specifically, this presentation is primarily based on my own focus group of 74 13 and 14-year-olds who are being educated within a private school environment. They are not representative of all tweens in New York City by any means, let alone a wider population. So that said, I've tried to make my presentation as general as possible. I've also made it hopefully light and applicable. I also went back and forth between pulling in statistics and studies on social media and tech use versus sharing observations from my classroom. And for this time, I decided to stick with the latter. That's because the major theme that I'm touching on, and this comes up in my ALA committee work and through my job, and also in the media, is that trends and data on young people in tech are changing very rapidly. And I don't think that we have any answers or solutions to questions right now. Someday I would love to do a part 2 of this presentation where I bring in fewer personal talking points and expand my takeaways to include broader trends as well as hard data. I would love to start with this icebreaker. You should all be able to write in the chat, but this is actually the same icebreaker that I used to start my very first 8th grade Digital Essentials class this year. What is your favorite way to unplug? And I'll start you off by saying mine is reading and baking bread. I bet we have other readers in the audience, but I would love to see your favorite way to unplug. Reading, yes. Crafting, woohoo. Playing tennis, amazing. Walking and biking, reading and tennis. Cooking with an audiobook, awesome. Walking, knitting, woohoo. Fellow knitters. I love webinars with librarians. It's always like readers and crafters and trouble unplugging, totally. I relate to that. Guitar, meditation. Yay, we're kitties, kitty lovers. Thank you so much for sharing. So when I was curriculum planning this year with my team, we decided that the topic of digital wellness would be particularly important to bring into our classes this year. At the end of last year, we were noticing a lot of different trends happening. When we went back in person, we were noticing that students were having trouble focusing while they were trying to complete tasks online. They were using their tech more, and they were really kind of not used to this unplugged world. And we didn't know the broader implications by any means, but we knew that we wanted to start conversations in our classrooms about it. We also knew this might be a challenge because there are always so many tech to-dos, especially at the start of the year. Although thankfully we did start in person this year, which made things much easier. So my idea was that by starting each class with a circle relating to digital wellness, we could start building a culture of discussion and respectful conversation around the topic. These were rarely heavy questions. I have a list of them on my next slide, although sometimes due to the answers I received, we did enter more serious conversations organically. For tweens and teens, I think it's even more important that their voices are heard when talking about topics like this. Otherwise, it really threatens to become a conversation from an out-of-touch adult just telling them how to behave online. It also gave us a routine for each digital essentials class, which is something I find really helpful, especially because this class is weekly and the students sometimes see it as non-academic. So it's kind of even more important to build structure around what we do every week in order to stay productive and respectful of each other. So we also integrate circles into many different areas of Berkeley Carroll. For those of you who aren't familiar with the circle conversation practice, they can be sequential circles where you go in a circle. They can be popcorn circles where you kind of pass a talking piece around to different people who want to share. The point is it gives every student a chance to use their voice at the very beginning of class. And it really helps to get conversations rolling. And by sharing even just a few words at the beginning of class, it usually makes folks more likely to keep sharing throughout the class. As I said, we integrate circles into most classes at Berkeley Carroll. So by 8th grade, the students are used to the norms that are expected during circle discussions. So these are just some examples of other circle questions that I used throughout the year. And hopefully you can kind of get an idea here. Like I said, I refrain from asking specific questions about student social media use because there's definitely disparity within every class on who uses social media, which platforms they use, and how frequently. My intention was never to put anyone on the spot to share anything personal. There's still a divide in the 8th grade between students who use social media and those who don't. Some students choose not to use social media, or some students are not allowed to. So I never, like I said, want to highlight anyone's personal experience without permission. But like I said in the previous slides, our conversations did often turn into social media use and personal stories when students felt comfortable enough to share. But you can see a lot of these questions had to do with the topic we were discussing that day, or just things that I thought would be fun to get the conversation rolling. So now I'm going to share a little bit more about Digital Essentials as a class. Like I said, I am a very fortunate information professional, especially in a middle school setting, to have a weekly class. Digital Essentials is a weekly digital skills class that all 5th through 8th graders take. As you can see from this list, it's definitely a hodgepodge of things that we aim to cover throughout the year. It's a chance for tech troubleshooting and answering tech and device questions. As you might imagine, it can be hard to keep a routine curriculum each year. 5th through 8th grade, we do have essential lessons that we cover, but even this changes from year to year. For example, the last 2 years, we were using much of our class time to work through remote learning needs, and that was less of a focus this year, thankfully. Once there are major projects happening across departments, it can be a time where we also work on the tech aspects of interdisciplinary projects. For example, right before this webinar, I was working with the 5th grade, completing their Egyptian Minecraft EDU worlds before their school-wide tomb presentation next week. And after the new year, 8th graders will use class time to work on 3D bridges, which is a huge collaboration with science. But we also use Digital Essentials time to introduce library resources and tech tools, provide research support, reinforce community tech norms, and finally, we do manage to fit in time to talk about digital citizenship, digital literacy, digital wellness, and technology in the news. As you might imagine, this is a lot to cover. And only having the class once a week, it can often feel sort of disjointed and disconnected, especially from the student perspective, and I'm aware of this. However, it is really unique that we have set time in the school day for this class, even if it's just really small slivers of moments to talk about digital habits. This is especially true this year when educators are spread so thin trying to cover and make up class content from the past 2 interrupted years, while also definitely realizing the growing need to incorporate social emotional learning into the curriculum, and especially behavior relating to technology. As I briefly mentioned, one downside of this class does include the fact that sometimes the concepts that we discuss, both tech related and behavior related, seem to live outside of the regular classroom. I'm not complaining. I'm glad they don't see me as an academic teacher per se. It kind of, I think, helps that our conversations can be more honest and candid, but also that's why I think it's even more important to make the conversations about their own lives and their own tech habits more relatable and more applicable versus like a top-down lecture style. Most school librarians, especially in a middle and high school environment, are running on a flexible library schedule rather than a fixed one. This means that students and teachers, for you non-librarians out there, can use the library and librarians as needed, but they rarely get a set fixed time with students like I do. So having a specific class is a really valuable platform for a school librarian. It's also a great chance to collaborate within my department, which includes the excellent middle school librarian, Christine Hartley-Maneri, and the director of Ed Tech, Aiden Lucy. We meet semi-weekly to discuss things we're noticing throughout grades and classes that we can help reinforce in our classrooms. This includes both hard tech skills we see students are lacking, but also SEL topics and current tech trends that might need to be addressed right in the moment. And I'll share a few examples of these in just a moment. One of the greatest things about this is that we don't have a set curriculum and we can quickly pivot and talk about anything that we need to talk about right before class if needed. So I'm going to move now into talking about the main takeaways from my conversations in the classroom in the past few years. Once again, these are primarily from the past few years with a specific population of 8th grade students. However, this current year is the one I've spent the most intentionally talking about tech habits. Although I've made a concerted effort to integrate conversations about digital consumption, I think these can be even more robust and integrated into different classes in following years. And I'm already thinking about next year and how we can make these topics integrated into different classes and different settings. So one big thing that I kept being reassured of, and I hope it reassures you too, is that tweens are certainly still unplugging. Based on a lot of media sources and stories, you might be tempted to think otherwise, but they are definitely doing a lot of things that do not involve technology. And in many cases, they openly admit to loving the opportunity to engage in unplugged behavior. Activities they mentioned repeatedly and that are popular are playing sports, reading, which about 90% of the 8th graders still much prefer to do on paper rather than digitally, which is very exciting. Generally hanging out with friends. And something that kept being brought up was that a lot of students are making concerted efforts to keep phones and social media away while hanging out. Also cooking. I think this must have been partially a COVID spurred activity, but it seems like there are tons of 13-year-old chefs in my classes, much more than usual. On this slide, you can also see some of the primary barriers they mentioned to unplugging, including the fact that they're never separated from notifications. This is primarily on cell phones after the school day and on weekends. In our middle school, we do take phones away during the day. So notifications from texts and social media platforms like TikTok, Instagram, and Snapchat were referenced as making their phones addicting and hard to put away for long. We also talked about FOMO, meaning the fear of missing out. So because so much is happening on social media, both personally as well as with larger trends and through communication channels like texting and FaceTime, it's really hard to put phones away and not feel like they're missing out on a larger 2021 discourse as a whole, but also on a micro level, just what's going on with their friends. So many students talked about even nighttime restrictions from parents being difficult. Like when parents will take phones away at night, they feel like they're missing out on group chats or things that are happening online without them. Students who don't use social media mentioned feeling alienated at times because so much socializing is happening in an online environment. Similarly, cell phones and communicating through FaceTime, texting, and group chats are how this age group is making plans. By age 13 and 14, parents aren't really setting up social hangouts anymore. So without phones in hand, it can be hard to make plans or make connections with friends or really know what's happening. And of course, being 13 and 14, they love to point out that school itself is a barrier to unplugging. Obviously during the pandemic, but also in general, school has pivoted to be very plugged in. So homework, research, and almost everything else is expected to be completed digitally. Teachers are making a concerted effort to get schoolwork back to pen and paper and reinforce those habits, but inevitably, this is really the reality of school in 2021. Phones and tech are now students' primary way of communicating with friends. Both the social media platforms that I mentioned above, they're used for entertainment and to pass the time, but also for communicating. For example, I learned this year that Snapchat is basically used as a texting system between friends. And FaceTime and video calls grew exponentially during the pandemic. And many students reference that it's continued to be a preferred communication method for after school and weekends, despite the fact that face-to-face opportunities during the day are almost back to normal. This probably sounds familiar to all of you, but tech is also a way to avoid boredom, distract from responsibilities, and also just a way to pass the time. Two of the most popular online activities that I heard about were playing video games and watching videos. And much like notifications, the word addictive was used a lot in the sense of like wanting to keep playing to another level or keep watching the suggested videos that were popping up on YouTube or keep watching episodes on streaming platforms. And some of our most interesting conversations came from realizing how much video game and video platforms lend themselves to this feeling of being addicted. For example, the shorter time between the autoplay videos, like you barely have a chance to say, no, I don't want to watch the next episode, as well as the highly personalized feeds where it seems like YouTube and even streaming platforms know exactly what you want to watch next. I've also just listed the pandemic here in general because it kept being brought up as a huge indicator of when students, and by the pandemic, I know we're still in a pandemic, but when we were remote learning, that was when students began to feel more connected to their tech. So for most students, it was the only way to communicate with their friends for over a year. And at such a critical point in adolescence when peer connections are more important than ever, this has still affected the way they continue to be connected with each other. So a few more takeaways, and I start this slide with a comment that for anyone who has taught 7th and 8th grade, you'll be familiar with the inclination to start pushing back. This is very different from my 5th grade classes where most of the conversations students are in agreement with each other and with me. But this change in discourse, it took getting used to, but it's also something I'm learning to appreciate a lot. It makes for more lively discussions. But the comments on this slide are mostly from light pushback I received when it felt like I drilled a little bit too much negativity into the conversation. I also don't think we could have reached a respectful discourse without working to build a culture of communication and respect beforehand. So one big thing that kept coming up was the hypocrisy that some students felt from adults, primarily their parents, telling them they were on social media or on their phones too much, while not practicing disconnecting themselves. I had to only admit that I agreed. And at one point I remember saying, to put it bluntly, there's more hope for you than there is for us, which is why we're having these conversations. And they thought that was funny, but I think it's a really good reminder that modeling responsible tech use and limiting our tech use is really important if we want young people to follow our lead. Because trust me, they are watching. Also, after a few podcasts about the Facebook whistleblower and congressional hearings with social media executives, I received some pushback about the alarmist and dramatic statistics coming out, in particular, those that reference the climbing numbers of social media hours logged during 2020. They understood that it was true, but to my classes, it was also obvious that the pandemic played a huge part in that. And while they admitted they still use it too much, they felt there wasn't enough critical thinking involved about the fact that tech was their main pipeline to staying connected with peers for most of the year. That said, I did experience hardly any pushback about the types of negativity that come from social media. So I'm currently planning a co-taught unit with our health teacher that expand on the issues of body image and social media, because the news reports about damage done to young people through social media were particularly prevalent the first months of the school year. And I found that students kept wanting to come back to it as a topic of conversation. Sources from the New York Times to Teen Vogue were reporting on data around mental health issues in social media, and as well as eating disorders directly tied to social media. Towards the end of this presentation, I'll talk about collaborations that have come just from these conversations where I haven't felt like I was the expert on some of these topics and I needed to bring in other people to help facilitate the conversations. As I said earlier, I never asked students to share directly how they felt their own mental health was impacted by social media, but they didn't argue when those aspects of the conversations would come up. So this is, like I said, a conversation we'll be continuing in the new year with health, as well as with the help of our school psychologist. There's also a lot of talk about being affected by popularity and like counts on social media, coupled with general skepticism about the steps that social media platforms have taken to reduce anxiety around these things, such as hiding like counts and social media break reminders. We also had a few instances this year already of problems starting on social media that bled into the school day. This led to really interesting conversations about digital citizenship, specifically relating to online drama that's easier to start behind a screen, even when more and more of the repercussions bleed into real life. So interestingly, but maybe not surprisingly, there was a lot of tech in the news the first few months of school alone, which is one of the main reasons I recommend staying flexible with your conversation plans if you're planning on facilitating your own. Some of our most dynamic conversations came from discussing short articles or podcasts that were released that morning and that had just come my way organically because of my own news consumption. One of the first things that occurred was an issue relating to the TikTok challenge in September that motivated students to vandalize schools. And this led to a very interesting discussion about doing things for attention on social media and likes or reshares, even when those actions are morally questionable, in this case, objectively wrong, and with the potential to create serious consequences for students. So we talked about the drive to attain popularity online, trumping the knowledge that there would actually be serious repercussions and what the mental thinking behind that might be. As soon as we started having conversations about tech use and digital wellness, it also seemed like the world started to shine a spotlight on tech use and young people specifically. This included Frances Haugen's whistleblower testimonial, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which revealed a lot of information on Facebook's responsibility for spreading misinformation and also causing mental health harm in young people. They were very quick to say that none of them used Facebook, but then I was quick to rebut that, okay, fill in the blank. It doesn't have to be Facebook. It can also be Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok as well. But specifically, we also made ties to the January 6th insurrection and the question of how responsible Facebook was for causing this. We were able to talk about less overt misinformation as well that they knew was being spread on platforms like TikTok just for the like counts, but how ultimately this was responsible for a lot of harmful information relating to things like the COVID vaccines. Because our school has a very liberal demographic and the kids are pretty aware of misinformation online, this led to conversations on how our own social media and internet use create our digital footprints that build algorithms that show us the content we want to be seeing, also known as filter bubbles. We also talked about personalized social media feeds and targeted ads. And one popular theme was how creepy, their word, it is that they're constantly receiving ads and posts about things they talk about out loud with their friends. So we were able to expand on these conversations and make ties to digital wellness and being more aware of our online activity as a whole. Like I mentioned above, many news sources from the New York Times to Teen Vogue published opinions and articles on mental health, eating disorders, and social media connections. I tried to vary the sources that I use for discussions, which is also one of the tips I'll share soon. Multiple times, students mentioned that all of the media coverage on these topics had made their parents enact stricter social media rules just that year, as well as screen time rules. In some cases, students were actually asked to delete social media apps from their phone, and others just said that their parents were talking more about their tech use with them more than ever before. And this is also important to realize. So these conversations may not just be coming from the classroom. It's always interesting to ask before we start today's lesson, what can you tell me about fill in the blank first? And how did you hear about it? Because I teach 5th and 8th grade, I sort of miss a critical window in the middle, but I thought it would be interesting to share some takeaways from one end of middle to the other. I also know that not all middle schools include 5th grade, and this is a unique situation. However, in my opinion, it makes it almost even more interesting to have a larger age disparity to compare. I've definitely focused much more on digital wellness conversations this year with the 8th grade rather than 5th, but I have had light versions of these conversations with my 5th graders as well. And this slide shows a few highlighted facts about the two age groups. Somewhere in between 5th and 8th grade, our students' ownership of smart devices increases by over 60%. I tallied this just literally by counting the cell phones in the cell phone boxes in the middle school office. This is the same for social media use. Unfortunately, I was not able to do our social media survey before this webinar that we do every year, asking for statistics on who's using social media, but I did pull numbers from last year. I'm hoping to do that really soon. I know obviously a lot of the disparity in this has to do with age restrictions and which parents at our school are enforcing more so this year than in others. But 5th graders are also in general spending more time unplugged. This is partly because they are involved in more extracurriculars and after school activities. They're also not as tied to their phones for communicating independently and are still often relying on their parents to make social plans for them. In the 5th grade, which I don't know if I said this, but for those of you who are not middle school educators, 5th grade is 10 and 11 years old. There's a lot more screen time restricting by parents, especially at nighttime and after homework is completed, devices are often taken away. In 8th grade, this is not so much the case. And the most common comment was that as long as homework and other responsibilities were completed, they had free time with their phone or other device. And often their phones were not even being taken away during the nighttime. The similarities, though, I found kind of striking. So 10-year-olds are also discussing the addicting pull of notifications on their home devices, and they're drawn to tech in the same ways. A lot of them are playing video games and are also starting to make the connection behind the difficulties in unplugging and how media and tech does that, especially when it comes to games and videos like I discussed earlier. So like I said a few times earlier, I'm very lucky to have a class to discuss digital habits, despite it having the drawbacks that I mentioned. But I would like to share some collaboration ideas for other school librarians who don't have a weekly or any sort of regular platform for integrating these conversations. As I also mentioned, even though these topics may not live in a set curriculum currently, they are happening, but it might take looking around for them. For example, through some poking around, I found out that the advising curriculum for all grades was hoping to include lessons on digital habits and digital wellness in the new year. And I've already been able to offer resources and materials as well as the takeaways I'm sharing now to get those started. And I'll be collaborating more in the new year with all of the grade teams. Our health program also talks about body image, and I'll be co-teaching units in 7th and 8th grade next year, specifically about how technology and social media has in many cases exacerbated body image issues and the objectification of bodies. We also started a mental health alliance affinity this year in the middle school. This was a student ask, and it's facilitated by our school psychologists. So in the new year, this group will specifically address needs brought up by students who don't use social media and are struggling in navigating the middle school experience while not being involved in this significant part of social life in middle. Also in classes such as humanities, language arts, debate, and civics, it's very likely that topics like misinformation, social media algorithms, and media bias are all being talked about. That might not seem like a direct tie to digital wellness, but you can definitely make connections. And I just thought it would be interesting to share some tips that I've found for successful collaboration with these conversations, for having these conversations in different classroom settings. During such busy times in schools, in many cases, it's up to us as librarians to find the entry points and proactively offer the resources and knowledge that we have. Also, because teachers are stretched so thin, especially this year, it can be hard to find these entry points. I found that building trust, even starting within one department or with one teacher, is one way to start spreading the word around to other classes. And when you establish yourself as the expert in any topic, but especially tech use, digital wellness, and social media habits, you can start building many sorts of collaborations around the school. And the reality is that regardless of the discipline, these conversations should be happening because they're really affecting every aspect of school life now. It can also be a good reminder that collaboration, when done successfully, is both a time saver and a benefit to everybody involved, including students and teachers. So it's important to make time to plan so that all areas you want to talk about are being covered. And for example, I mentioned earlier, I don't feel as qualified to talk about the harm to mental health that's being exacerbated through social media, but I found out students did want to talk about it. So this is what has led to a more planned and thoughtful collaboration with our health and psychology experts in the school that will happen in 2022. Also, collaboration can look many different ways, from sharing resources to co-planning entire units. It's important to remind teachers you're there to support them however it's appropriate or however they'd like to have you in the classroom. So before I conclude, I did want to share some hopefully concrete tips about what worked and what didn't when facilitating these important conversations. Once again, these tips are from my own classroom, and I know every classroom looks different, but I hope they will be general enough that they can be applied to other educational environments. First, build in enough time for dialogue, interaction, and engagement. It's going to be really hard for these topics to sink in or to really speak honestly about them if you're just lecturing, but it can also be really hard to fit these in. You saw the kind of laundry list of things that I'm supposed to cover in my classes, and sometimes it's hard to fit in topics on unplugging with a Google Classroom best practice or Google Drive organization, but both are equally important, especially this year. But if you want to have those meaningful conversations, you really need to set aside the time. Second, listen to what tweens and teens have to say. While we are experts in many capacities, we are not 13 and 14-year-olds navigating social media, and the way it is being used is changing a lot. And trust me, they will love telling you when you're off base about something. I learned so much about my students' habits, many of which were very positive. I was touched by some of the stories they told me about maintaining connection and using social media to share stories and videos and pictures that bring them joy. They'll also know when you're talking about something you know nothing about. So bring them into the conversation as experts, and you will learn a lot, trust me. Relatedly, balance the negative and the positives of tech and social media. Don't drill students every class or even every week with fear mongering or alarming statistics and negative impacts. It's important to balance this out with good news. And as I said, conversations about positive experiences online, because they are happening, even if it means asking them directly, what's something that brings you joy or happiness from the internet or from your phone? You also want to incorporate different media sources. So while we all may be tempted to stick with our paper of choice, try to find articles from different places. Ones written for young people are maybe obviously preferred. I found a lot of interesting articles in Teen Vogue, for example, that were written to the audience as peers and not to teachers or parents who will be inclined to lecture after reading them. Also, anticipate emotion, disagreements, and also changes in the plan. Sometimes our conversations went much longer than expected, and sometimes I had to say, let's put a pin in this until we have more time or until I can find more experts to help me out in answering your questions. Social media in particular can be a very hot button issue, and you want to be careful with making things too personal for students and also steering conversations away from potentially contentious interpersonal relationships that are taking place in the classroom. Also, conversely, be prepared for conversations that don't work or don't stick. I remember finding a podcast I thought was really interesting about how much screen time had increased in the past few years, and I don't think anything else I shared got so much pushback because they felt it was judgmental and didn't put their perspectives into a real context. Finally, build a culture of trust as much as possible before facilitating these potentially difficult conversations. Don't assume students will share honestly off the bat. It took a few weeks of lessons for my students to realize I wasn't actually there to be nosy about their online habits or gather information from an authoritative position. I was really just interested in getting them to think about their tech use in a more thoughtful and intentional way. In conclusion, I'm not going to say that these conversations have solved any significant problems or provided answers to any large questions. I don't think those solutions exist yet or answers. But moving forward, I hope to ensure that the conversations are happening not just in my classroom, but in every grade level and across the middle school curriculum. Future plans involve helping to create advising lessons for each grade level, like I said, as well as expanding the conversations to other structured and unstructured places such as affinity spaces. The more we can integrate these conversations into the classroom, the more students as well as educators will become comfortable engaging in them. If anything, I'm just happy we've started the conversation. I think without dialogue and critical thinking and learning about actual habits, we're not going to be able to even start understanding the effects, both positive and negative, that tech is bringing to the lives of young people. One of the best moments recently was when a student came up to me and asked if I had heard about Instagram's new take a break feature. They said they read about it and wanted to know what my thoughts were on it. And I proposed the question back to them. Their response was, I'm not sure how much good it will do, but I'm glad companies are doing more things to realize how addicting they can be. And that was small, but it meant our conversations have been sinking in. And that is the end of my presentation.